World War II didn't ignite simply with tanks rolling into Poland in 1939. Its true origins are buried in a decade of humiliation, collapse, and betrayal. The Treaty of Versailles demanded 132 billion gold marks, plunging Germany into ruin as hyperinflation spiraled to 4.2 trillion marks per US dollar. While the world watched, a failed revolutionary named Adolf Hitler transformed his defeat in 1923 into a manifesto for vengeance and power. The real reason World War II started? It was a slow-motion disaster fueled by economic desperation, global indifference, and the rise of an ideology no one dared confront. Until it was too late. The question is, could war have been stopped before the first shot was fired? On June 28, 1919, Germany's fate was sealed with a signature in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles. The treaty blamed Germany alone for the war, demanding 132 billion gold marks in reparations, an amount so vast it equaled multiple years of the entire nation's economic output. Territory was stripped away, including the coal-rich Saar, Upper Silesia, and the industrial heartlands needed for recovery. 13% of German land was lost overnight. The country watched as Alsace-Lorraine went back to France and new borders carved up communities. More than 6 million Germans suddenly found themselves outside their own country, cut off by lines drawn on maps. This was not just a political wound. Everyday life turned desperate. When Germany tried to pay its impossible debts, the economy fell apart. By 1923, the mark collapsed. Prices exploded by the hour. A loaf of bread cost 200 billion marks. Banknotes became worthless paper. Workers were handed wages in wheelbarrows, only to watch their value vanish before they reached the shops. At the peak of hyperinflation, the exchange rate hit 4.2 trillion marks to every US dollar. Savings disappeared. Middle-class families sold jewelry, furniture, even their winter coats just to buy food. Shop windows filled with bartering, not cash. The old order crumbled under the weight of hunger and humiliation. The world noticed, but it didn't intervene. Britain and France focused on their own recoveries. The United States, untouched by the fighting, looked away. While Berlin burned through money, the international community left Germany to spiral. Despair ran deep. Faith in democracy evaporated as politicians failed to solve the crisis. Extremist voices found an audience among people who had lost everything: money, pride, and hope. In this climate, anger and fear became the only currency that held its value. The shattered promise of peace paved the way for those willing to offer radical solutions, no matter the cost. On the night of November 8, 1923, shots echoed through Munich's streets. Adolf Hitler, a decorated soldier turned firebrand agitator, marched into a beer hall with a pistol raised. He declared a national revolution, hoping to topple the local government and seize power. But the coup unraveled within hours. Bavarian police opened fire, 16 Nazis died. Hitler was arrested, charged with high treason, and locked away in Landsberg fortress. But the trial did not end his ambitions. Instead, it handed him a national stage. Hitler used the courtroom as a pulpit. Over 24 days, he spoke for hours in carefully crafted speeches. He did not deny his actions, he called them necessary. "I wanted to be a prophet, but instead I became a political criminal," he told the judges. Newspapers across Germany printed his words. The failed coup became a rallying cry, an act of patriotism, not betrayal. The judges, sympathetic to his nationalist cause, gave him a sentence of just 5 years. He served less than 9 months. Inside his cell at Landsberg, Hitler began to write. He filled notebooks with his beliefs and memories. By 1925, his manifesto, Mein Kampf, pronounced Meine Kampf, appeared in bookstores. The book blamed Germany's defeat on Jews, Marxists, and foreign enemies. It called the Treaty of Versailles a crime. It outlined a vision of racial purity and conquest, arguing that Germans needed more land to survive and flourish. The personification of the devil as the symbol of all evil assumes the living shape of the Jew, he wrote. These words would become central to Nazi doctrine, but Hitler's strategy would change. He realized that violence alone would not win Germany. From prison, he plotted a new path: propaganda. He studied how words, symbols, and spectacle could move crowds. Nazi posters flooded marketplaces and train stations. Rallies turned political meetings into mass theater. Hitler repeated the same slogans over and over. Simple, emotional, impossible to ignore. The swastika became a brand. The message was clear: Germany had been betrayed, but it could rise again. If only the people found unity under a single will. As years passed, the Nazis learned to turn anger into action. Their speeches railed against communists, Jews, and politicians who had stabbed Germany in the back. They promised hope instead of humiliation. In streets scarred by poverty and shame, these words found an audience. Hitler's defeat in Munich had taught him a lesson. Power would come not just from bullets, but from turning despair into belonging and hatred into purpose. On September 18, 1931, a railway explosion near Mukden gave Japan the excuse it needed. Within hours, Japanese troops pushed deep into Manchuria. The Chinese government called for help. The League of Nations, just a decade old, debated as Japan consolidated its control. League delegates met in Geneva, issued statements, and sent the Lytton Commission all the way to Asia to investigate. The commission took 7 months to deliver its findings. By the time their report condemned the invasion in October 1932, Japan had already set up a puppet regime, Manchukuo. When the League called for withdrawal, Japan simply walked out in March 1933. No sanctions, no military action, just speeches and paperwork. A few years later, the world watched again as Italy prepared to invade Ethiopia. In October 1935, Mussolini's armies crossed the border using tanks, bombers, and poison gas against soldiers on horseback. Emperor Haile Selassie pleaded for support at the League's Grand Assembly. Delegates applauded his speech, then debated for weeks. The League voted for sanctions, but oil and coal, vital for war, were left off the list. British and French diplomats hesitated, afraid of driving Mussolini toward Hitler. Over 8 months, Ethiopian cities fell. By May 1936, Mussolini's troops entered Addis Ababa. The League's moral authority crumbled on the world stage. Member states saw that aggression brought rewards, not consequences. In the corridors of Geneva, doubt replaced hope. League officials drafted resolutions and declarations, but dictators took notes. The lesson was clear. Borders could be redrawn, treaties broken, and the world would watch. The promise of collective security faded. The door opened for those willing to test how far they could go. On March 7th, 1936, German troops crossed into the Rhineland. Under the Treaty of Versailles, this was strictly forbidden. The German soldiers carried little more than rifles and nerves. Hitler had told his generals, if France resisted, to pull back at once. But France did nothing. British leaders called it a coming home for the Germans. The League of Nations filed protests. No action was taken. For Hitler, the gamble paid off. The demilitarized zone was gone, and the German army stood on the border of France. Nearly 2 years later, on March 12, 1938, German forces rolled into Austria. This was the Anschluss, the annexation of Hitler's homeland into the Reich. Crowds cheered in Vienna. Austrian officials surrendered without a fight. Britain and France raised objections, but their cabinets were divided. Some feared another war would be worse than any humiliation. French Premier Édouard Daladier hesitated, his generals warning that France was not prepared for a direct confrontation. The Anschluss stood unchallenged. Germany grew larger, more powerful, and more confident that the West would not interfere. In September 1938, Hitler demanded control of the Sudetenland, a border region of Czechoslovakia with a large ethnic German population. British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain and Daladier flew to Munich for talks. They wanted to keep the peace at almost any cost. Over tense negotiations, they agreed to Hitler's terms. Czechoslovakia was not at the table. Chamberlain returned to London waving a piece of paper declaring peace for our time. But the Munich Agreement gave Hitler exactly what he wanted, without firing a shot. Outside Europe, some newspapers praised Chamberlain for averting war. Inside Germany, the message was clear. Aggression brought rewards, not resistance. Hitler boasted to his generals that he had seen his opponents up close and found them weak. Daladier, facing crowds in Paris, admitted privately he felt shame, not relief. The policy of appeasement had bought a few months, but at the price of trust and security. Each concession made the next demand easier to justify. By the spring of 1939, the map of Europe had changed. The hope for peace had become a dangerous illusion. On August 23, 1939, two men stood in the Kremlin and signed an agreement that would change the map of Europe. The Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named for Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and Nazi Germany's Joachim von Ribbentrop, was presented to the world as a simple non-aggression treaty. The real deal, however, was hidden from public view. In secret, the two sides drew lines across Eastern Europe. The protocol divided Poland along the Narew, Vistula, and San rivers. Germany would take the west, the USSR the east. The Baltic states were split as well. Estonia and Latvia fell to Moscow's side, while Lithuania was promised to Berlin. The Soviets claimed Bessarabia, eyeing new ground on Romania's border. These arrangements had nothing to do with self-determination. Stalin and Hitler agreed to carve up whole countries behind closed doors. The pact destroyed any hope that the West might deter Hitler. For Poland and its neighbors, it was a death sentence sealed in ink before a single tank crossed the border. At 8 p.m. on August 31, 1939, 6 SS men led by Alfred Naujoks stormed the Gleiwitz radio transmitter near the German-Polish border. They carried pistols and wore civilian clothes. Inside, the German staff were forced to the floor as Naujok's team seized the microphone. A Polish-speaking SS operative read a short message in Polish, declaring the station in Polish hands and urging attacks on Germans. The signal only carried a few words before being cut, but it was enough. Outside, the body of Franciszek Honiok, an ethnic Polish prisoner, was dressed in a stolen uniform and left as evidence of a firefight. SS doctors had drugged him before he was shot. By dawn, Nazi radio blasted the story of a Polish raid. The next morning, German troops crossed the border. Hitler told the world Germany was responding to unprovoked attacks. The war had its pretext, scripted the night before in a Silesian radio tower. On August 23, 1939, the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact's secret protocol carved Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. Just 8 days before the German invasion of Poland. This was not a sudden act of aggression, but the final step in a long chain of failures. The punitive Treaty of Versailles in 1919, hyperinflation that reached 4.2 trillion marks to the dollar, and a global depression that shattered faith in democracy. Documents from the League of Nations confirm repeated warnings ignored as dictators seized Manchuria, Ethiopia, the Rhineland, and Austria. Despite volumes of evidence, some Soviet-era files on negotiations remain sealed, and the full decision-making process behind appeasement is still debated by historians. Today, the record is clear. World War II began not with a single event, but through years of crisis, compromise, and unchecked ambition. The evidence shows how international paralysis and misguided peace policies made war all but inevitable.